Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to John Titus, who is featured in the new documentary Bailout, opening in Chicago on May 16th at the Unibox Theater in Chicago. The documentary features interviews with Chris Whalen, Eve Smith, Dylan Ratigan, Noam Chomsky, and others. Now let's turn to a clip of the film.
The fear-mongering began when Paulson showed up before Congress. I mean, he had a gun to America's head, and he said, if you don't give us the $700 billion, we're going to wreck the financial markets.
That's what the banks have on America. That's financial terrorism. To the end of 2010, the financial institutions have been handed $2.8 trillion of money from the American taxpayer.
This is jobs, this is growth. We're taking probably $600 to $700 billion a year out of the hands of consumers to subsidize the banks. That's what the Fed's low interest rate policies are doing.
It is enough to make you want to lose your mind when you understand the mathematics. It's like me fixing your pinky when you've got cancer.
All right, well, looking fantastic there. Let's talk to some folks involved in the film. John Titus, you quit your job as a highly paid lawyer and made this film, Bailout. Tell us about it. What's so important about the message of the film that you simply had to make it?
Well, the coverage of the financial crisis in the U.S. hasn't been told properly, we didn't think. There was really no narrative holding it together. It's couched in terms of complexity and excess leverage and all sorts of jargon that no one really understands, when the reality behind the financial crisis here is that it's one of fraud having been perpetrated by Wall Street on Main Street. You know, Wall Street has essentially stolen money from Main Street, and that's really what's hobbling the economy here. And that story hadn't been told yet, so we set out to do that on film.
Lehman is a crazy story in and of itself, because they were telling people we need $10 billion to survive. 10, 20 billion and we'll be okay. When all was said and done, they had a $600 billion hole in their balance sheet. Bernanke's whole goal is to attempt to allow these banks to earn their way with time and with gifts from the Federal Reserve, with quantitative easing and purchasing the bad assets, allow them to earn their way back to solvency, and it's not going well.
The problem is that their people were paid. The losses are coming from shareholders and from the public. It's not coming from the management of the bank.
Only a few people knew what was going on, and only those same few people were the ones that were collecting, and to this day collect hundreds of millions and billions of dollars a year in personal compensation, all of which I believe should be clawed back.
Increasingly in the U.S., they can claw back salary if the bank takes a loss.
But the banks will do anything to avoid getting that money clawed back, even cook their books. The bottom line here is, accounting fraud is now Wall Street's business model.
Well, this is something that most people overlook, or they don't want to look at it, because it would begin to unravel a series of connections in this fraudulent Ponzi schemes that would ultimately refer back to themselves. Isn't it true that everybody is complicit in this fraud to some degree, and looking in the mirror is simply not going to happen in a country like America that's based entirely on financial fraud?
Well, it depends on what you mean by everyone. And if you look at ordinary Americans, for the most part, they're disengaged. And I think to the extent that you can get ordinary people engaged by laying out the bare facts of what has happened, then they will rise up and protest what has happened in this country, which is that Main Street has been fleeced by Wall Street. And as far as complicity, you are correct that this fraud and this theft could not have been perpetrated but for the complicity of various people, high-ranking people in government. So that much is true.
Now, in the film, Dylan Ratigan uses my phrase, thank you, Dylan, financial terrorism. As a lawyer, a former lawyer, do you think this is an accurate accusation of what we saw in 2008?
Yes, but as an initial matter, I used that phrase myself in the question, in fairness to Dylan. But yes, it's financial terrorism, and it's simply threats. I mean, everything is couched in terms of threats. The word systemic, the phrase too big to fail, these types of things are nothing but threats to government officials saying, do what we want, or you will suffer grave consequences.
Right. Well, beyond being a threat, of course, it's an actual exploding financial device that takes lives. In the case of Greece, around the world. These are murderers. Let's keep that in focus. Now, aside from all the interviews, you crossed the country on a road trip in this film. Tell us about the population, what they understand about the financial collapse. Who are they blaming?
For the most part, bankers. And what we found is that a lot of people understand quite clearly that they've been wronged by Wall Street. They may not know the particulars of it, but there is no mistake in the part of people on the wrong side of the financial crisis that this is not some accident. This is an act that is quite deliberate, and that is the source of anger for a lot of ordinary Americans, and that is exactly what we found on the trip and tried to capture on camera.
Now, you plan on traveling to Europe for the sequel, Bailout 2. In the past weeks, we've seen a voter backlash to the extreme austerity measures in Europe used to bail out the banks. Compare the response in Europe to what you see in America. I know you haven't been in Europe, done the traveling yet, but from your observations so far, clearly with the uprisings in Athens and elsewhere, how would you contrast the two from what you've observed so far, John?
Well, what's going on in Europe is really, 1 or 2 years ahead of what's going on in the U.S. And I told Sean when we got into this project, if you want to know what's going to happen in the U.S., just keep your eye on Greece. People there are waking up, and they're rising up against basically a captured government that acts at the behest of bankers and blames everything on debtors rather than on the creditors who made these bad loans. And that's largely the narrative that's prevailed here for the U.S. in the U.S. so far, which is that everything is the fault of the naive borrower, and everybody overlooks the complicity and the guilt of the sophisticated creditors with all their data in making these bad loans to begin with. So Europe is ahead of the U.S. in terms of understanding what's going on with the crisis. However, the European press does a far better job of covering the crisis and of covering financial markets than does the U.S. media.
Yeah, well, exactly. As you point out, the emphasis has been to blame the debtor of the equation in this mortgage fraud, and it's blank Fine's defense, isn't it? He's saying, as a rapist, as a financial rapist, he's saying, well, she asked for it. That's his defense, which isn't going to play well forever. I mean, at some point there's going to be some justice. Now let's talk about Ireland for a second. The IMF loan was almost entirely to cover the costs of one failed private corporation, Anglo-Irish. And yet even here, it is the austerity victims of the international banking crimes that get the blame. So once again, the financial rapist is blaming the victim. Have you looked at Ireland very closely, and do you see, because they've been somewhat quiescent in this, not quite like their Greek counterparts. They seem to be somewhat quiet. Do you think there'll be an awakening there anytime soon?
Well, if I recall correctly, about a year or two ago, the IRA in Ireland had gotten aboard the bandwagon against these fraudulent bankers who had strangled the economy. And then, at least over in the U.S. at least, I kind of lost track of that. And now it seems like that is coming back into the fore. So I'm really, frankly, kind of confused about what's going on in Ireland. It seems to ebb and flow over there, the public awareness of the true forces that are at work behind the crisis.
Well, I think that would be an interesting question to explore when you come to Europe and you travel through Ireland. Hopefully you can talk to folks in the IRA and ask them what their take is. I know, as you point out, they were making some announcements, some proclamations a year ago or so. They've been pretty quiet. Sinn Féin is gathering votes in Ireland. And we see this, another trend in Europe. We have the votes are increasing in the parliamentarian participation from the extreme left, the extreme right. In Greece, they can't form a majority government. This is in France. They have a new socialist government. So on the margins, on the political scene, these alternative political voices are making inroads. I am struck by the inability. Let me just change gears for a second, John. The Occupy Wall Street movement, of course, is is directed toward Wall Street, but Wall Street's crimes around the world are not necessarily most egregious in New York area, in the Wall Street area. They are most apparent in countries like Greece. Why, this is my question, John, why wouldn't a few thousand of the Occupy folks simply go over to Athens and set up camp in Athens? Because that's the front of the global insurrection against the banker occupation is in Athens right now. Why don't we see New Yorkers and Occupy people from around America setting up shop in Athens right now to fight the banking terrorists? Why doesn't that happen in your view, John?
For the simple reason that I think Occupy is still trying to find its footing. I mean, they're still in the process of debating and discussing what's gone on and trying to figure out, what the Occupy movement really means. I mean, during the fall of 2011, it was directed into Wall Street. Then winter came, and there was a lot of silence, a lot of discussion, and now it's come back, and the movement seems to be, if you can call it a movement really yet, directed in a lot of different areas. So I think until the Occupy people sort of center in on one or two or three platforms or issues, that it's really a little bit premature to conceive of people from the U.S., Occupy people from the U.S., going abroad to, say, see how it's done, as you might put it.
All right, finally, John Titus, your film Bailout. What do you want the audience to leave with? What message should they walk out of the theater having been exposed to, and what should they be thinking about?
Simply that this crisis really isn't about too much leverage. It really isn't about greed or speculation or any of that nonsense. It's really simply about fraud. And ordinary Americans, Main Street, has been defrauded by Wall Street 6 ways from Sunday, and it's no more complicated than that. This notion that everything's complex and too hard to understand is a bunch of rubbish. It's a very simple story, and that's what people should leave with.
All right, we're out of time. John Titus, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report. Good luck with Bailout.
Thank you, Max.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, John Titus. His film is Bailout, opening at a theater near you. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.